Now, we are not the first generations in the Enlightenment Emancipation era to grapple with these questions of how do I maintain my Jewishness while participating in the outside culture and world. In fact, the roots of Jewish diversity go back much deeper than the 20th century, and much long before we had the experience of intermarriage. You know, when I was presenting that sketch in our first session of Jewish communities as living in these isolated worlds, they were not totally culturally isolated. After all, we'll see that the Jews in Baghdad spoke Arabic, albeit their own dialect of Arabic, and the Jews in Salonika often knew Ottoman Turkish to do business, or Greek to do business with other people, even if their home language was something else. Their style of dress, the kind of food they ate, all of these were influenced by the outside world. So it was kind of a permeable bubble. It wasn't a strict, isolated experience going through time in a time capsule. And the roots of Jewish diversity go back a long time, going back over 2,000 years, in fact, to this period of Hellenistic life. Now, imagine that you were a Judean living in 175 BCE. In the recent centuries, you'd experienced multiple empires coming and going. First, you had the Babylonian Empire, which exiled you, and then you had the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great that allowed you to return and rebuild your temple in Jerusalem. And then around the year 330, you have Alexander the Great and his Macedonian Greek Empire showing up, conquering Egypt, conquering the Middle East, ultimately destroying the Persian Empire and taking over. And even after Alexander dies, the continuing influence of Greek culture and Hellenistic government remains. So first you had one of Alexander's generals named Ptolemy, who was based in Egypt, who founds a new capital called Alexandria. It was founded by Alexander when he was there, but Ptolemy chooses it as his capital and greatly develops it. And they exert influence over the land of Israel for the first 100 years or so of this Hellenistic period. And then around the year 200 BCE, another empire takes over, also a Greek empire, also descended from one of Alexander's generals. In this case, it's the Seleucid Empire coming out of Seleucus, who was based in Syria. So by the way, if you hear in the Hanukkah story that the Syrians were attacking the Jews, it's actually the Greeks who were based in Syria, who were living a Hellenistic empire and Hellenistic culture based in Syria. And it's not that it was brand new. The Hellenistic culture of Egypt had already been influencing Jewish people for many centuries. And there might have even been other Hellenistic influences through traders and merchants and cultural exchange happening long before this. Now, your holy city, living as a Jew in 175 BCE, would be Jerusalem. That was where you made your pilgrimages. That was where you sacrificed at the temple. That was where the priesthood was based that defined what you should and should not do with life. But surrounding you, there's also this wonderfully attractive Hellenistic culture with cityscapes, with a marketplace in the center of your town, not a temple, but a marketplace, with international travel and trade, with an amphitheater and a hippodrome for popular entertainment, sometimes gory and sometimes dramatic, with plays and dramas and singing. There were the attractions of Greek literature and Greek philosophy, the opportunity to be part of a wider world. And you didn't have to necessarily give up who you were to do it. You see, there's actually two kinds of Greek culture operating in this period. One is Hellenic culture, which is Greek culture done for the Greeks and by the Greeks. And the other is Hellenistic culture, which is like that diaspora where you take the Greek culture, you plant it in native seeds, and it grows up differently. One of the famous examples of this was during his conquest, Alexander intentionally married off 100 or so of his best soldiers to 100 native women in Persia, because the goal was, let's mix. Let's feel part of both, with Greek on top, with Greek in charge, of course, but still you could maintain some other kind of identity that was in dialogue with and exposed to and influenced by Greek culture. So when you became Hellenistic, it didn't mean you became totally Hellenic and Greek. You couldn't change your grandfathers, but you could change how you lived your identity. So for this hypothetical Jewish person living in 175 BCE, you could choose to stay true to your ancestors and have nothing to do with these Treifa Greek temptations out there. The second option is you could assimilate to Greek culture as much as possible and abandon as much of your Jewishness as you could do. And so you don't circumcise your children, and you cut your hair differently, and you go to the gymnasium, and you exercise in the nude, and you participate in the gladiatorial events. And that's who you are. You are part of this Greco-Roman world, just as a Roman citizen or as a part of the global Greek diaspora. Or option three was to try to find a middle ground. Maybe you change how you dress, maybe you cut your hair in the Greek style, but you still maintain a sense of yourself and some version of Jewish identity and practice. So we can see evidence of this by some of the sources that come out of this period. One example of this is the books of Maccabees, which were actually commissioned by the Maccabees when they became kings after the successful Maccabean revolt. And the first book of Maccabees was most likely written around the year 100 BCE. So we'll take a look at the very beginning of that, the first couple chapters of the book of Maccabees. And so let's start our slideshow here for our second one. Again, written around 100 BCE, it describes the arrival of Alexander, who came out and struck Darius, the king of Persia, and afterwards his generals took over. So this is actually the real history here. And finally, a sinful root, Antiochus Epiphanes, who is the great-great-great-grandson of Seleucus, because the empires went Seleucus the first, his son Antiochus the first, then Seleucus the second, then Antiochus the second. So we're down to Antiochus the fourth. He reigned in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks. In those days, transgressors of the law came out of Israel and persuaded many, saying, "Let us go make a covenant with the Gentiles around us, for since we were separated from them, many evils have befallen us." The proposal was good in their eyes. They eagerly went to the king. He authorized them to observe the ordinances of the Gentiles. So they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem, according to the laws of the Gentiles. They made themselves uncircumcised. They forsook the holy covenant, joined themselves to the Gentiles, and sold themselves to do evil. This is not outside persecution. These are Jews who are choosing to connect with Gentile, Goyish, whatever you want to phrase, non-Jewish culture. And so the attractions are there. The gymnasium, being like the other people, learning their language, even hiding the circumcision, because for the Greeks, the body was seen to be a perfect form. And why would you deface the body by cutting off a piece of it, especially that part? Now, we speculate at this time, by the way, that the original Jewish circumcision was not as radical as the procedure is today, such that one could try to disguise it. It was just a sort of cosmetic cutting initially, as opposed to a total removal of the foreskin, which is how it's done today. And it may be that Jewish practice expanded how serious that surgery was in response to this circumstance where Jews tried to hide the fact that they had been circumcised. And so King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom they should be one people and abandon their laws. And notice again, many of Israel consented to his worship, sacrificed to the idols, profaned the Sabbath. He sent letters to the cities, to Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, forbid burnt offerings and sacrifice in the sanctuary, profane the Sabbaths and feasts, pollute the sanctuary, build altars and temples for idols, sacrifice swine's flesh and leave their sons uncircumcised so they would forget the law and change the ordinances. And there's actually very strict persecution for this. But there's also the pietists who reject it. The ones who forsaken the law were gathered by the king, and Israel had, the true Israel, the ones that weren't colluding with the king, had to hide themselves in every place of refuge. And finally, in the peak of disaster, they built an abomination of desolation upon the altar in Jerusalem and idol altars elsewhere. They tore the books of the law, which they found in pieces, and sent them on fire. Anyone with a book of the covenant or following the law was condemned to death. And notice today, on the 25th of the month, on the 25th of Kislev, they sacrificed upon the idol altar. And they put to death women who had circumcised their children. Notice the date, the 25th of Kislev. If you know your Jewish calendar, that's actually the first day of Hanukkah now. So we didn't pick the date. This is the date that they defiled the temple. And later on in the book of Maccabees, it says that's the date they reformed the temple, they rededicated the temple, and Hanukkah literally means dedication. So it's a reform. But the Maccabees are found in verse 62. Many in Israel were fully resolved and confirmed in themselves not to eat unclean things. They chose to die, to not be defiled with the food, to not profane the Holy Covenant. Those pietists who did not want to assimilate insisted on not doing it and then dying. Now, I will point out, this is a case of clear religious persecution. And this is unusual in the Greco-Roman world. In most cases, Hellenization happened by attraction and persuasion, not by forceful imposition and the threat of death. So it is unusual to find this happening. Nevertheless, this dynamic of some going along and some resisting will provide the impetus for the Maccabean rebellion, because when Mattathias sees a Jew sacrificing at the altar, he actually is moved by his zeal. He's the patriarch of the Maccabees, and he strikes the Jew who is about to sacrifice and kills him on the altar. And then, because he knows he has to flee after this murder, whoever is zealous for the law and maintains the covenant, follow me. And he goes to the mountains, and then that begins the Maccabean revolt. And many who sought justice and judgment went into the wilderness there to avoid the pollution. And in the end, these Hasidians, these pious believers, gathered together an army. They struck sinners in their anger, and the rest fled to the Gentiles. They went around and pulled down the altars. Verse 46, they forcibly circumcised the boys who were uncircumcised, as many as they found in the coast of Israel. They pursued the arrogant, and the work prospered in their hand. They rescued the law out of the hand of the Gentiles, out of the hand of the kings, and they never allowed the sinner to triumph. So what you see here is the pious of the hill country, because Modi'in, where the Maccabees are from, is sort of middle of nowhere hill country, striking back against the assimilated of the cities. The coastal plains where the large cities were, Caesarea and Jaffa, what today is near Haifa, and Tel Aviv. Those are the major cities going back to Canaanite times. That's where the most cosmopolitan people lived. That's where the Hellenization was strongest. And the hill country pietists, we still have that phenomenon today of rural versus urban when it comes to religiosity, insisted on maintaining their Jewishness without pollution. Now, there is an irony here, of course. And the irony is that the Maccabees themselves became Hellenized. The books of Maccabees we have today, we only have in Greek translation. In fact, it's likely that the second and third books of Maccabees were only written in Greek. The first book might have been written in Hebrew and then translated into Greek, and all we have is the Greek translation. But you can even see it in the names of the Maccabees. They begin with strong Jewish names like Mattatyahu and Yehuda and Shimon. And then after a couple generations, it becomes Aristobulus and Hyrcanos and even Alexander, worst of the worst. So Hellenism progressed. It was irresistible in some ways. The attractions of the marketplace, of this global culture, of the aesthetics of Greek life, the art and entertainment and so on. It was very tough to resist. We see this as well, even in later generations, where rabbis begin to ask, is it allowed to learn Greek wisdom? They're making these laws, these halachot that I talked about in our first part. And so they asked the question at one point, what is the role of Greek wisdom and what is its danger? And so rabbis centuries later are looking back on the Maccabees and they write this story. When the Hasmoneans were at war with each other, Hyrcanos was besieged inside Jerusalem and his brother Aristobulus on the outside. You can see the names, right? And every day those inside would lower money down in a box to purchase sheep to sacrifice. And those on the outside would send up sheep for the daily offerings. They were maintaining the ritual practice. There was a certain elder there who was familiar with Greek wisdom. And he said, as long as they are able to perform the temple service, they will not be delivered into your hands. The next day they sent down money in a box, but they sent up to them a pig. When the pig reached the midpoint of the temple wall, it stuck its hooves into the wall, and the land of Israel quaked for 400 leagues by 400 leagues. And at that time, the sages said, cursed be the man who raises pigs, and cursed be the man who teaches his son Greek wisdom. Now, what's the relationship here between Greek wisdom and this transgression of taking the money but giving a pig in exchange? Well, it could be a couple things. It could be that Greek wisdom teaches you to be clever and subtle. And so by learning philosophy, by reading about Odysseus in the Odyssey, you'll learn these kind of tricks. Or maybe once you are exposed to Greek wisdom, you're not averse to transgressing what a good pious Jew would never even consider transgressing. I mean, it takes chutzpah to even suggest something like this or to try to do it. It takes a distancing from the Jewish tradition that you hold pious and inviolable to be able to present the pig as a substitute in order to undermine the dynamic from inside and outside. So the sages curse the man who raises pigs, but also curses the man who teaches his son Greek wisdom. And yet the Talmud continues in its asking questions and discussing, is it really prohibited to study Greek wisdom? There's a famous teaching that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who helped to compile that Mishnah, that first collection of rabbinic sayings, around the year 200 of the Common Era, he said, in the land of Israel, why speak Syriac? Use either the Lashon Kodesh, the holy tongue, or use Greek. So if Rabbi Judah said you could speak Greek, why can't we speak Greek? The sages say, well, we distinguish between learning Greek language and studying Greek wisdom. That's philosophy. That's dangerous. The language is business. It's whatever you need to do to get things done. And even so, they ask, is Greek wisdom really prohibited? Here's a story that Shimon ben Gamliel told, and it was passed down by word of mouth. There were 1,000 children in the household of my father, 500 studied Torah, and 500 studied Greek wisdom. In other words, Gamliel, who was the head of the rabbinic court at the time, Shimon's father, allowed 500 of his students to study Greek wisdom. And the only ones left of those 1,000 who studied are here, I and my cousin in Asia Minor. This is in the Babylonian territory. And the sages responded, well, the household of Rabban Gamliel is different. They had to work with the government. For example, cutting your hair in the Roman style is forbidden. So a way of the Amorites. It's something you're not allowed to do on pain of being cut off from your people. But Avtolemos bar Reuven was allowed to cut his hair because of his ties with the government. And notice his name, by the way, Avtolemos. So they allowed the household of Rabban Gamliel to discuss Greek's wisdom because they had to talk with the government. But notice, by the way, there's also an implicit judgment here, because what happened to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel's household where he allowed them to study both Torah and Greek wisdom? 998 of them are gone, and only 2 are left. So there's clearly a sense of the danger, but also the ongoing attraction of Greek culture to the Jews. And we know this also by that passage we saw earlier from Mishnah Sanhedrin that mentions the Apikoros. What is an Apikoros? Well, it comes from the Greek philosopher Epicurus. If you want to read a philosopher that really speaks to modern secular people, Epicurus is the one to go for. Because Epicurus's approach was, yes, I believe there are gods out there, but they have nothing to do with human beings. Because why would a god have their happiness depend on whether a human being prayed to them or offered a sacrifice to them? Would they really go hungry if we didn't sacrifice them? What kind of a god is that anyways? Well, the gods have nothing to do with people. And don't worry about Hades or an afterlife, because we are made up of atoms, of individual, little discrete objects. And after we die, those atoms disperse and we simply are no more. As he wrote, before I existed, I wasn't. And after I'm gone, I won't be anymore. So there's nothing to be afraid of with death. We should, in fact, make the most of this life. We should enjoy good food. We should enjoy good friendship. In fact, Epicurus trained himself to only like very simple diet, bread, basic vegetables, and water, because if that was what he liked, then he could always satisfy it. If he were looking for rich foods all the time, he would be destined to be disappointed. And if the goal is happiness in this life and a kind of elevated happiness, then simple food and getting used to it will actually allow you to be happy more often. And the irony is, in modern English, by the way, there is the word to be an epicure, but that is someone who loves rich and fancy foods. It's sort of the opposite of what Epicurus wanted. That was sort of the stereotype of the Epicurean, who was so focused on this world that they wouldn't sacrifice for the next life. They would be a glutton in this world. That's not how Epicurus meant it, and that may not be how the Jews who read Epicurus meant it. notice that the word apikoros becomes the generic rabbinic word for heretic. So there might have been enough Jews reading Epicurus that they then made that the epithet for those Jews who don't follow Jewish tradition. They know the Jewish laws and they don't follow it. They're not an am haaretz, an ignoramus. They're an epikoros. They're a heretic who knows better and nevertheless has studied Greek wisdom and has left Jewish tradition behind. So there was clearly a deep and ongoing attraction to Greek thought and lifestyle among the Jews. And so the land of Israel was under the control of the Ptolemaic Empire based in Egypt from the time of Alexander the Great until around the year 200 BCE. And in that time period, the specific gravity, the black hole's attraction of people of culture and looking for opportunity of their capital city of Alexandria was almost irresistible. Think about how many Jews, even to this day, still live in New York City. At one time, it was 80% of the American Jewish population. Now it's still maybe, I think, about 45% of the American Jewish population, because it's a global capital of commerce, of entertainment, of industry and development. And Alexandria was the same in the ancient world. At one time, it was actually the largest city in the world, even larger than Rome at one period. And by the year 0, it was so attractive to Jews that this city was thought to be 1/3 native Egyptian, 1/3 Greek, and 1/3 Jewish. Now, Jews moved there during the Ptolemaic period of 300 to 200 BCE, but they stayed there afterwards, obviously. And I'm sure many more chose to make that move as well, even after the change in power, and maybe even more accelerated between the Seleucid persecution of traditional Jewish practice and then the Maccabean persecution of Hellenistic Jewish practice. You can imagine many of those Hellenized Jews might have fled the pious, Taliban-style Maccabee kingdom, at least in its early days, until they Hellenized for the greener pastures of Hellenistic Alexandria. Now, Alexandria itself was a port city right on the mouth of the Nile and looking out onto the Mediterranean. And so that made it open to all kinds of global influences. One of its major attractions was the Lighthouse of Alexandria. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, actually survived in some form into the 1400s until an earthquake knocked it down. And it made Alexandria a very attractive port. It could be seen for 40 leagues away, and that made it easier to find and easier to make port there from other manufacturing centers around the Mediterranean. Ptolemy and his heirs also made it a global city of culture. There was public support for major institutions of learning, including most famously the Library of Alexandria, which was probably the largest collection of texts to be found anywhere in the world at the time, although the text had to be in Greek to be able to put in the library, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. And attached to that library was an institution known as the Institution of the Muses, or the Museum. It's actually the first use of that word, museum. And in this case, it wasn't just to store old objects, it was an academy of music and poetry and philosophy. And if you were lucky to achieve an appointment at the museum, you got free room and board. And at one time, there were up to 1,000 scholars who were being put up at the museum at the government's expense to further the intellectual development of the society, to refine manuscripts of the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Greek classics, to explore philosophy, to create music and poetry. It was public sponsorship of public intellectuals, which made the city a very attractive place to be. Wouldn't you want to be in a place where that kind of creativity is possible and people are writing new plays and putting them out? I mean, that's the attraction of a great metropolis. And of course, as a port city, it was also an opportunity for commerce and to create your own life to some extent as a new immigrant, because there's lots of new people coming in. And even more importantly, it was an opportunity to explore more freely what the Hellenistic world had to offer, where you didn't have to worry about a pietistic Maccabean priest showing up and forcibly circumcising your son or forcing you to cut your hair or grow a beard out because you've followed the Greek practice a la Alexander of shaving your face. As I mentioned, Alexandria, the city, was founded in 331 BCE, and Ptolemy took over after Alexander's death in 323 BCE. The capital, Alexandria, was declared in 305 BCE. And by the Roman period, so we're talking by around the year 0, let's say, or the first century of the Common Era, there were around 500,000 people living in Alexandria, which for the ancient world is a huge, huge population. So what was Jewish life like in Alexandria? Well, the Jews filled 2 of the 5 quarters. They were, a full third of the city. And they may have also represented as much as a third of the ancient Jewish population anywhere in the world. Remember, Jerusalem and the land of Israel was an important center, but some Jews who had been in the Babylonian exile stayed there and didn't bother to come back with the returning exiles. So some Jews were in Babylon, some Jews were in the land of Israel, and a large number of Jews were in Alexandria. And they were living this Hellenistic lifestyle there, but represented a large part of the Jewish community. And this, by the way, also turns on its head the historical cliche that Jews lived in Israel as long as they could, and then the Romans conquered them and forced them out. Well, no. The Jews in Alexandria were attracted there and chose to live there many centuries before the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, which doesn't happen until 70 of the Common Era. So if they begin to be attracted to the Ptolemaic period, in that period 300 to 200 BCE, that's, again, 370 years before the temple is destroyed in Jerusalem, and they're forced out. They weren't forced to Alexandria. They chose to go to Alexandria. Among the innovations created by Jews there, among the innovations created by Jews in Alexandria was a house of meeting. The word for a house of meeting in Greek was synagoga. It was the synagogue. It was a place of gathering together. In fact, the Hebrew for it is Beit Knesset, which also means house of meeting. And in these Alexandrian synagogues, we find inscriptions written in Greek, including inscriptions like, "This bench was donated by so-and-so." What else is new in the Jewish world? We've been doing that for a long time. But the synagogue was an opportunity to come together as a Jewish community without having to go to the land of Israel, and to create a new kind of doing Jewish that didn't involve sacrificing animals, because you weren't allowed to sacrifice animals outside of Jerusalem and the temple. So you had to come up with something else. So maybe you read the text about the sacrifices. Maybe you came up with a reading cycle of the holy literature. Maybe the clergy in charge would teach the deep meaning of a particular text. It's the beginning of the rabbinic sermon. So you have all these religious innovations born of both the freedom to do so in Alexandria and the necessity to do so because you were so far away from Jerusalem in an era of very slow transportation. Alexandria also sees a literary innovation in Jewish life. It's the creation of a book called the Septuagint. It's a translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, not just the Torah, by the way, the first 5 books, but the entire Hebrew, what is sometimes called the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. There's a famous letter called the Letter of Aristeas that claims to tell the story of how this Bible got translated. It claims that the king of Egypt at the time, based in his capital in Alexandria, was looking through his library and said, I heard that the Jews have a book that's really, really good and really interesting, but we don't have it here. So maybe we should commission people to translate that book from Hebrew into Greek so we can have it here for our Greek scholars to study. And so they took 70 scholars and they put 70 scholars in 70 different rooms to each translate the whole thing. And at the end of that process, they took out all the 70 different translations and compared them one to the other. And lo and behold, they were all exactly identical. Well, that could only be a miracle. That could only be a sign that God himself had endorsed this translation from Hebrew into Greek, and therefore it maintained a holiness that the Hebrew text had naturally. The Greek text maybe could have been up for debate, but by that miracle of translation of 70 scholars coming up with the exact same translation, it must be divinely inspired. Now, did the Greek king commission a translation? Maybe, unlikely. It's much more likely the Jewish community themselves commissioned a translation, and without the 70 scholars and the miracles and so on. By the way, sometimes in academic writing, the Septuagint is rendered as LXX, which is the Roman numerals for 70. And that's why it's also called the Septuagint, sept as in 70. So, or 7 as at its basis. That's where it gets the name. But the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, may well have been done for Jews internally, either to share their wisdom with the Jews and the non-Jews outside who didn't know Hebrew, or because there were enough Jews in the synagogue who didn't know Hebrew that they needed the Greek translation for themselves. Remember, those God-fearers in the back of the synagogue might want to know what's going on, so maybe having a Greek translation would be helpful. And after a couple generations of your kids learning Greek and learning Greek and learning Greek, maybe the Hebrew schools weren't so good and they needed the translation to know what was happening. In fact, as one example of this, one of the leaders of Jewish Alexandria at the time, whose name was Philo of Alexandria, who wrote a lot of Jewish philosophy, when he quotes the Bible, sometimes it's very clear he's quoting the Septuagint and not quoting the Hebrew Bible. So he may not have known the Hebrew Bible, or may not have felt he needed to check the Hebrew Bible's version, because the Septuagint was accepted as the Bible of Alexandrian Jews. Just as today in an American Jewish context, you can read the Hebrew text of the Torah, but you want people to understand it, you're going to have to put it into English translation. Philo represents another strand of this harmonization between the two when he begins to write what we today call Jewish philosophy. He tries to use philosophical terms and categories to explain Judaism in Greek, either to a Jewish audience reading it or to a Greek audience who want to learn about what these weird Jews are doing. And so he begins his story trying to explain why in the creation epic, God makes the world in 6 days and rests on the 7th. And his argument is that 6 is actually the most perfect number, because it's the only number that is both the sum and the product of its parts. 1 plus 2 plus 3 equals 6. 1 times 2 times 3 equals 6. The perfect number. And so if you're going to create the world, why not use the most perfect number to do it? Now, this brings to mind the difference between logic and reason. Logic says this axiom leads to this conclusion. Reason says, does this really make sense? And, I might say this is logical, but not reasonable. But he also frames Moses as a lawgiver, which is a venerable category in Greek philosophy. You have Solon, the lawgiver of Athens, and so on. Well, Moses framed as a lawgiver, Moses as having reached the heights of philosophy, as is one of Philo's phrases, is trying to frame Moses not as a magical mystery worker, a la the exotic Orient, but actually as a highly developed philosopher in the role model of the role models of Greek thought and Greco-Roman thought by Philo's time. And Philo lived around the year 0. So his innovation of trying to harmonize Jewish thought and inherited tradition with Greek philosophy and categories of thought will become a very prominent part of Jewish life from the Middle Ages with the Renaissance of Greco-Roman philosophy in the Arabic Middle Ages and in Europe, and into the modern period as well. Now, lest you think everything was peaches and cream, there was also a lot of tension going on in Greek Alexandria, because when you have a city that's a third, and a third, there's often jockeying for position and authority and dominance between those different groups. I mentioned earlier on the challenge of good citizenship. You're supposed to sacrifice to the city gods, and the Jews chose not to do that, or to the Roman emperors later on. The Jews didn't want a statue of the Roman emperor in their synagogues and their places of worship, and they were thought to be bad citizens because of it, or perhaps they could be accused of being bad citizens because if you have a rivalry with a Jew in business and you can undermine his position in society by bad publicity. I mean, they didn't have Yelp reviews, but this is the equivalent. You could get an economic advantage. And there was even some tension with the native Egyptian population as well. There's a writer who writes at the end of the 1st century of the Common Era. So this is around the year 90, 100 of the Common Era. His name is Josephus. And Josephus is a bit beyond our focus for this workshop in his biography, but one of his most famous books is called Contra Apionem, or Against Apion. Apion was an Alexandrian Egyptian who had become somewhat Hellenized, and he wound up and ginned up the outrage against the Jews for some of these violations, including the citizenship question. And he was in fact part of a delegation to Rome to justify the fact that there had been a pogrom, a riot against the Jewish community by the native Egyptian community in Alexandria. Philo also went to this meeting, by the way, and they made their contradictory presentations at whose fault it was that there was such a riot in Alexandria. These riots took place around the year 38 of the Common Era. But in Josephus's Contra Apion, Apion evidently had written a book where he listed all the terrible things that Jews did. And Josephus wrote a response to that against Apion. We don't have Apion's book anymore, but we have Josephus's rebuttal to Apion's book. So we get an idea of the kind of accusations that were thrown against the Jews, like this bad citizenship claim. There was a claim that Jews actually hated the Greeks. And one of the first versions of a blood libel, where the idea that Jews would take a Greek person and starve them and then sacrifice them for their rituals, appears in one of Apion's accusations. Or another one is another Alexandrian Egyptian who had been Hellenized named Manetho, who wrote a history that claimed the Jews were kicked out of Egypt not because of their God and all the miracles in the Exodus story, but because they were infected with leprosy and disease and they stank, and the Egyptians couldn't stand them, so they said, get the hell out of here. That's an alternative version of the history. Of course, Josephus doesn't agree with Manetho's version, but Manetho doesn't agree with the Hebrew version that says the Jews conquered the Egyptians and the Jewish God beat the Egyptian gods. So there's this rivalry that's part social, part political, part economic, part religious, and all dangerous and violent. It turns out there was another round of violence between Jews and non-Jews in Alexandria in 66 BE during the Great Revolt, and then ultimately the community is fatally undermined during the period 115 to 117 of the Common Era, during what's called the Diaspora Revolt, when a lot of Jewish communities outside of the land of Israel have major uprisings against the Roman power structure and are ultimately put down by Roman legions. So here we have this wonderful flowering of, say, 400 years from 300 BCE to 100 CE, more or less, of this Hellenistic Jewish community that produces the Septuagint, that produces Philo, but by the way, is not preserved by the mainstream of Rabbinic Judaism. We wouldn't have Philo. We wouldn't have many of the books that appear in the Septuagint, but not in the Hebrew Bible, if not for the Catholic Church. In fact, it was the church that preserved Philo and Josephus because they testified to the time of Jesus, and they preserved the Septuagint as their Old Testament. If you look at a Hebrew Bible, a Jewish Bible, you'll notice the books are in a different order. And if you compare it to a Catholic Old Testament, there are some books in there that don't appear in the Jewish Bible. For example, the books of Maccabees that we saw at the beginning are not preserved by the Jews. They're preserved in Greek translation as part of the Catholic Old Testament, which comes down from the Septuagint. They were Jewish books. They were preserved and created by a Jewish community, but they were saved by the Catholic Church and ignored by the Jewish world for many centuries until almost the pre-modern world. So we owe them gratitude, not for much, but for that. But there is one other source that we can look at that testifies to the attractions of Hellenistic Judaism as an alternative to the emerging Rabbinic Judaism. And those are the stories of a rabbi named Elisha ben Avuya. And he is living around the year 130 of the Common Era. This is in the days of the Bar Kokhba revolt. And we only know his name because some sources preserved it. Other sources refused to even use his name, and they use a substitute name, Acher. Acher means the other, because we don't even want to keep track of his name. And there are stories of him recorded in both the Babylonian Talmud and in the what's called the Palestinian Talmud or the Jerusalem Talmud, which were compiled in those two locations in the land of Israel and in Babylon. With different versions of the stories, but clearly he was an important figure, and he was a stand-in for all those Jews who were asking those Greek questions and were seduced by the attractions of Greek culture. So here are some examples of these statements about Elisha ben Avuya. It is said of him, of Acher, that when he entered a meeting place for scholars and saw youngsters with scrolls in front of them, he would say, "Why do these sit here and occupy themselves thus? This one's craft should be a builder, that one a carpenter, that one a painter, that one a tailor." And when the youngsters heard such talk, they left their scrolls and went away. So what is he saying, seeing the kids studying Torah? Get a real job. Go make something. Notice all these jobs are making and doing things. It doesn't say be a philosopher or be a professor. Be a builder, be a carpenter, do something, make something. in the real world. And that was seductive. They left their scrolls and went away. It is also said of him, of Acher, that Greek song did not cease from his mouth, and whenever he rose to leave the house of study, heretical books would fall out of his lap. It's like the image of the person who has a book inside of a book, is reading something else instead. In fact, I did a funeral for someone about 20 years ago who noticed in the 1950s that his Reformed temple that his wife wanted to join, he didn't care. They had a prayer book called the Union Prayer Book. And he noticed that the Union Prayer Book was the same size and shape as the Loeb Classical Library, which had works of Greek philosophy and literature in it. And so he would bring a volume of the Loeb Classical Library to services and read that instead. And people thought he was being so pious and focused. He's so focused on the prayer book when actually he's reading Greek philosophy. He's, again, like Elisha ben Avuya, the Apikoros, who has heretical books even in the house of study. And when he hums a song, it might be a Christmas carol. It might be a Greek song, something from the outside world. Now, one of the questions they ask is what made him become this Apikoros, which made him become a heretic? One suspects that it's when he saw a pig dragging along in its mouth Rabbi Chutzpit, the interpreter's tongue, who had been killed as a martyr. And he said, the tongue from which pearls of purest ray is to lick the dust. In other words, he was an interpreter. He was a wonderful teacher of rabbinic tradition, and he was martyred and suffered and died, and a pig is dragging his tongue. There's no reward. There's no justice here. One of the famous phrases attributed to him, although not in the original sources, is leit din veleit dayan. There's no justice and there's no judge. Or another example, he has a mystical experience, and he saw Metatron, who is an angel, who's like the prosecuting attorney, who was given permission 1 hour each day to write out the merits of Israel. But he's sitting down to do this writing. And Elisha ben Avuya said, I thought that on high there is no standing and no sitting. You can't do this. Maybe, heaven forbid, there are two divine powers, because here's someone that isn't God doing things in heaven. Well, they punished Metatron for leading him astray, but also Metatron was to burn out the merits of Acher, because Acher had studied Torah. He had earned points, but he's sinning so much that in the end, the merits are canceled. A heavenly voice came out and said to Acher, return, rebellious children, except Acher. You are not allowed back. And his response was, well, if I'm banished from that world, I'll go enjoy myself in this one. And he went out to do evil things. He found a prostitute and propositioned her. She said to him, aren't you Elisha ben Avuya? Everybody knows, that famous rabbi. And so he grabbed up a radish on the Sabbath and gave it to her, breaking the law. So she says, oh, you must be Acher. Or maybe you've become Acher. You're now a different person. One more speculation of what made him go wrong is this story, that he was sitting and studying, and he saw a man climb to the top of a palm tree on the Sabbath, take the mother bird with the young, and descend safely, which you're not allowed to do. At the end of the Sabbath, he saw another man climb, and in one version of the story, he shoos the bird away, follows the law, and a snake bites him and dies. He dies. Elisha exclaimed, it is written, let the mother go and take only the young. Where is the well-being of this man? Where is the prolonging of his life? Since that is so, his conclusion was, there is no reward for the righteous, and there is no resurrection of the dead. And that is the breaking point for Elisha ben Avuya. Well, there's one more Elisha story I want to share before we have our last sort of comments and questions as we're coming up on the top of the hour. It's a story set near the end of Rabbi Elisha's life. Elisha had a famous student. His name was Rabbi Meir, one of the preeminent rabbis of the next generation. And one day, Rabbi Meir was teaching in the house of study on a day of atonement that happened to fall on a Sabbath. And he looked out the window of his house of study, and he saw his teacher, Elisha, riding a horse through the city. So already in the setup of the story, you see he's breaking the law blatantly, riding a horse on a Sabbath that's also the Day of Atonement. Nevertheless, one is duty bound to honor one's teacher. And so Meir leaves the house of study and goes out to walk with Elisha ben Avuya. And Elisha asks Meir, you were in the house of study, what were you teaching? And Meir gives examples of things he were teaching, and the texts he quotes are all passages that say, come back, repent, you'll be welcome. And Elisha, to each one, finds a response and says, no, I think the interpretation is different. And he offers one that maintains his separation from the community. And still they walk and they talk for a certain distance until then Elisha stops Meir and says to Meir, Meir, you need to stop here and turn back. Meir says, why? Elisha says, this is the boundary of how far you're allowed to travel on the Sabbath. Meir says, how do you know that? There's no sign, there's no eruv, there's no boundary. And Elisha said, well, I calculated that my horse's steps covered this much ground, and I counted how many steps we had covered in all that time while we're having this high-level Torah discussion, and I know you're at the boundary of how far you can go. And Meir one more time invites Elisha, come back, but Elisha says no and carries on riding away. Now, is this an example of accepting the diversity of Jewish choices, that some Jews might ride on Shabbat and some Jews might not? Well, not quite yet, because Meir is still trying to draw Elisha back. But he is still learning from his teacher, and there is still a dialogue between the two. That might have been the ideal of the Hellenistic period, if a Hellenistic Jew could have talked to a Maccabean or an early rabbinic Jew and offered some insight and had some common ground of conversation. That might be a shift from a plurality where there are many Jewish options that don't like each other to a pluralism where they learn from each other and have that fruitful and constructive dialogue. Perhaps the seeds were planted of having that common ground. And so I'll stop at this point. We've got about 5 minutes left. If you do have any other comments or questions that you want to add in and share, you can feel free to type those in the chat or ask somebody in the Q&A. And while you're doing that, I'll tell you a funny story that comes from recent Jewish history about this question of Jewish pluralism and actually riding on Shabbat. So I saw the anecdote on social media, but people there knew the people involved, where a Reform rabbi was driving in his car on Shabbat. And another car pulls up next to him, and the other driver rolls down his window and says to the Reform rabbi, how dare you wear a kippah, wear a religious head covering while driving on Shabbat? And the Reform rabbi says back to him, how dare you drive on Shabbat and not wear a kippah? It all depends on what your priorities are, because for the Reform rabbi, wearing the kippah was being Jewish to him and driving on Shabbat was irrelevant. And for the other Jew, it felt like a violation of terms to be wearing a kippah and driving on Shabbat. But of course, the other guy was also driving on Shabbat. He just didn't have a kippah on. So maybe this is that world of argument and dialogue that we're hoping for, albeit in a confrontational way, but at least having a common vocabulary to argue over.